How was Solomon's temple built? The so-called First Temple of Israel was not just a building. It was such an advanced architectural feat that even today, engineers and archaeologists continue to wonder how it was possible to build something like that 3 millennia ago. A sanctuary covered in pure gold. A sea of bronze supported by 12 giant oxen, colossal columns, cyclopean stones, craftsmanship worthy of an empire, and a holy of holies designed with a precision that defies all human logic. But the big question remains, how did they manage to build it 3,000 years ago? What tools did they use to move stones that would require industrial cranes today? How did they melt and mold a sea of bronze the size of a modern swimming pool? And how many tons of gold did they use to cover the most sacred sanctuary of the ancient world? Dear brothers and sisters, in this video we will delve into the heart of this mystery. We will analyze the opinions of modern experts, review what ancient texts say, and discover the methods that made possible one of the most extraordinary works in human history. I invite you to watch this video until the end, because when you find out the actual amount of gold that was used, you will be speechless. Before we continue, I want to invite you, with all our appreciation, to like, subscribe to, and share this video, because in doing so, you are supporting this ministry. And also, beloved brothers and sisters, we want to thank you for joining us each day. We deeply appreciate you in the Lord's love. May the peace of Jesus Christ be with you and your entire family, and may this video be a great blessing in your lives. Let's get started. When Israel left Egypt, they didn't just leave slavery behind. They were guided toward a greater purpose. In the desert, at the foot of Mount Sinai, God revealed something no ancient nation had ever seen. He not only gave laws and established a covenant, he gave instructions for building an earthly dwelling where his presence would reside with them. Thus the tabernacle was born. It was not a human creation. Every measurement, every material, and every piece was described with divine precision. The desert became a sacred workshop where Israel learned how to build the house of God. Men like Bezalel and Oholiab received supernatural wisdom to work with gold, silver, bronze, and fine fabrics. The materials were fit for a king, not a nomadic people, and the tabernacle stood like a palace tent in the midst of the camp tents. Each time the cloud of glory moved, the Levites dismantled the structure and raised it again where the Lord indicated, teaching the people that the presence of God should always occupy the center of their spiritual life. In that portable sanctuary, Israel learned the meaning of holy worship, sacrifice, adoration, holiness, and reverence. Although temporary, the tabernacle became the eternal model for the temple that would later be built in Jerusalem. It was a shadow of something greater. Solomon's temple would be its fulfillment. When Israel conquered the Promised Land, the tabernacle remained the center of worship for generations. But as Jerusalem grew into the capital, the nation worshipped the eternal God in a simple tent. This contrast awakened a greater vision in King David's heart. David, a devout worshiper and a man of covenant, understood that God's presence deserved a permanent dwelling place. Although he desired to build the temple, God determined that the work would not be accomplished by his warrior hands, but by his son Solomon. Even so, David dedicated his final years to preparing everything for that future work. He amassed immense quantities of gold, silver, bronze, and precious stones. He organized Levites, priests, and musicians. He contributed resources that, according to modern researchers, would be equivalent to billions of dollars. He did so not to aggrandize his kingdom, but to honor the King of Heaven. Archaeologists and theologians agree that the grandeur of these preparations reveals David's spiritual purpose. He knew that the temple would not be just a building, it would be the heart of Israel. It would be the place where God would permanently manifest his presence. That is why he left an incomparable treasure ready so that Solomon could build a house worthy of the Lord. Finally, David gave Solomon the complete plans for the sanctuary. The Book of Chronicles states that these plans were given by divine revelation. It was not a human design, it was a heavenly model. With the resources, plans, and purpose established, Solomon undertook the task that would become the most glorious architectural work of the Old Testament. The tent of the tabernacle had fulfilled its purpose. Now was the time of the temple. It was a time of splendor. When Solomon came to rule Israel, he was about 20 years old. He was young, but not inexperienced. He had grown up under the tutelage of King David and had been groomed for leadership from childhood. However, despite his young age, he inherited a commission that would have been overwhelming even for veteran kings. He received not just a throne, he received a divine mandate to build the temple where the presence of the God of Israel would dwell forever. Solomon knew the project required more than military strength or political power. It required supernatural wisdom. That's why the first thing he did as king was to seek God's favor. Before laying a single stone, he offered a sacrifice. There, in that act of worship, God appeared to him and granted him a wisdom that would distinguish him for generations. Biblical historian John Walton explains that the wisdom Solomon received was not only spiritual, it included administration, architecture, logistics, and the ability to manage massive projects. Israel needed a young but wise king, and God had prepared him for this moment. With his kingdom established, Solomon took the plans that David had prepared through divine inspiration. These plans were not mere drawings. They were a heavenly design revealed by God for his house to be built with excellence. Solomon understood that Israel could not build such a monumental project alone. Therefore, he reaffirmed his alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre. This alliance would provide the technical expertise necessary to work with royal cedar, colossal bronze, and highly skilled artisans. Archaeologist Michael Aviona notes that the union between Israel and Phoenicia combined spiritual vision with technical ability. Israel had the purpose, Phoenicia had the skilled labor. At the age of 20, Solomon organized the largest labor structure Israel had ever seen. The temple was built on Mount Moriah, within the city of Jerusalem. This location was not chosen for strategic or political reasons. It was chosen by God from ancient times. Rabbi Rashi explains that Mount Moriah is the mountain where Abraham was willing to offer Isaac. Their faith was manifested, and there the glory of God was to be manifested in the temple. Archaeologist Benjamin Mazar, after years of excavations in the area, stated that Mount Moriah was, from the beginning of Jerusalem, the most sacred point, the spiritual axis of the city, and the natural place for the temple. Mount Moriah was a rocky, stable, and elevated mountain. Its position dominated the city. From there, all of Jerusalem could be seen, and the temple could be seen from everywhere. This was no accident. Rabbi Nachmanides teaches that the temple was built on the place where heaven and earth meet, a unique spiritual point on all the earth. Furthermore, Mount Moriah was already marked by a sacred act, the altar that David had built when he stayed the judgment upon Israel. That place where mercy had triumphed became the foundation of the eternal temple. Thus, in the year 966 ante Cristo, in the heart of Mount Moriah, a work began that united more than 183,000 workers, including porters, woodcutters, expert stonemasons, supervisors, and skilled artisans, along with priests dedicated to the service of the temple, were all under the direction of Israel's wisest king. It was not just another construction project, it was an act of national worship. It was the beginning of the most magnificent building of the ancient world. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus writes that no building on earth could compare in position, design, and significance with the temple that stood on the holy mountain of Jerusalem. Now, when we talk about Solomon's temple, we're not talking about an ordinary building. We're talking about a structure that combines mathematics, ancient engineering, international logistics, and a level of technical skill that still amazes modern architects. To understand its majesty, we must analyze its proportions, its materials, and the exact way in which it was constructed. First, the proportions, a perfect mathematical design. The main building measured 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. This is approximately 27 meters long, 9 meters wide, and 13.5 meters high. Modern architects assert that these measurements were not accidental. Israeli architect Edamir Richman explains that the temple's proportions follow a balanced geometric pattern. The relationship between length, width, and height is a stable and functional proportion, similar to modern principles of architectural harmony. Archaeologist Yigal Shiloh adds that these proportions match actual Phoenician and Canaanite designs, confirming that the temple was built by highly skilled craftsmen, not by improvisation. These measures achieved three essential effects: structural stability, visual beauty, and a sense of grandeur without compromising the building's integrity. It was, quite literally, the ideal proportion for a monumental temple made of heavy stone. Secondly, the giant stones: weight, size, and technology. The temple stones were enormous. Archaeologists have found similar blocks in Solomonic structures, allowing them to estimate the size of the original stones. Architectural archaeologist Lean Rittmeyer estimates that many stones weighed between 2 and 8 tons, and some even more than 12. They were Cyclopean stones, carved with absolute precision. Researcher Israel Finkelstein claims that Israel applied Phoenician techniques, the most advanced in the Mediterranean. First, wooden rollers to move blocks over land. Second, oil-lubricated sleds, a technique proven in Phoenician excavations. Third, ramps of compacted earth to lift stones without the need for modern cranes. Fourth, wedges and levers to adjust each block with millimeter precision. One impressive fact: no iron tools were used to place the stones on the mountain. All the stone was worked down below in the quarries and arrived ready to be put in place. This requires almost perfect precision. Modern engineer Christopher Dunn, known for his analysis of ancient structures, concludes that with hundreds of trained workers, primitive pulleys, rollers, and ramps, it is entirely possible to move stones of up to 20 tons without modern machinery. Third, the Cedar of Lebanon, the royal wood of Solomon's temple. One of the most admired materials of Solomon's temple was the Cedar of Lebanon. It was not a common wood. It was the most prestigious wood of the ancient world. It was the material of kings, the wood of imperial palaces, prized for its aroma, its strength, and its almost eternal durability. And for the temple, Solomon needed thousands of trunks of this majestic species that grew only in the snowy mountains of Lebanon. Archaeologist Michael Aviona explains that the cedar trees felled for the temple were truly giants. Many were over 30 meters tall and had trunks so wide that it took several men to encircle them. Cutting them down was no improvised task. The Phoenicians, considered the best carpenters in the Mediterranean, used reinforced axes, fine saws, and a system of wooden wedges that exploited the natural power of water and cold. The lumberjacks would open a crack in the log, place dry wedges inside, and then soak them in ice water. As the wedges expanded, the log would split with a clean, dry sound, without splintering. It was a technique known only to Phoenician masters. But cutting down the tree was just the beginning. Next came the most dangerous part, hauling it down from the peaks of Lebanon. The freshly cut logs were lashed to enormous wooden sleds. Between 20 and 30 men pulled on thick ropes, slowing the descent to prevent the log from sliding uncontrollably down the slopes. Studies by the ancient engineer Jean-Pierre Adam show that to move such heavy logs, wooden rollers were placed on the ground, allowing the log to advance without sinking into the earth. When the logs reached the valley, they were loaded onto reinforced carts and transported to the coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon. Something amazing was happening there. The Phoenicians took logs and tied them together with ropes to form giant rafts. They were so large they looked like small floating islands. Archaeologist Avraham Negev explains that the currents of the eastern Mediterranean allowed these rafts to travel long distances without breaking. Phoenician ships guided them from the coast of Lebanon to the port of Joppa, the closest port to Jerusalem. But even after the sea voyage, the work wasn't over. From Joppa, the cedar had to be transported almost 55 kilometers uphill to Jerusalem. It was a grueling journey. The logs were placed on ox-drawn carts, and rollers were used to overcome the steepest sections. Groups of men pushed and stabilized the logs, stopping every few kilometers to prevent accidents. Historians say that Solomon ordered roads to be widened and temporary ramps built just to move the timber toward Jerusalem. This entire process reveals the scale of the temple and the importance of cedar. Rabbi Abarbanel said that God chose this wood because it was incorruptible, resistant to the passage of time, and capable of preserving its aroma for centuries. That is why it became the wood of the sanctuary. A wood that does not rot, that is not attacked by insects, and that symbolizes the permanence of God's presence. Historian John Bright states that moving the cedar from Lebanon to Jerusalem was an international feat without parallel in the 10th century BC. A project that combined diplomacy, engineering, and thousands of workers, all to build a house that would reflect the glory of the eternal God. Fourth, the gold of the temple, the splendor of the God of Israel. If there was one material that defined the interior of Solomon's temple, it was gold. It wasn't mere decoration. It wasn't luxury for luxury's sake. It was a theological message made tangible. The interior of the sanctuary was designed to reflect the visible glory of the eternal God. Therefore, every surface of the temple, every wall, every utensil, every corner of the Holy of Holies was covered in pure gold, shining as if it were a fragment of heaven descended to earth. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, describing the temple centuries later, wrote that when the first rays of the sun passed through the entrance, the interior shone with such intensity that whoever looked inside had to look away because of the brightness of the gold. For Josephus, the temple not only shone brightly, it radiated the glory of God. But the big question arises: how was this gold worked? What techniques did Solomon's artisans use to cover an entire building with such a precious metal? And how much was needed to achieve such splendor? The gold for the temple came from the finest deposits in the ancient world. It came from Ophir, famous in the Bible for producing the purest and most lustrous gold. It also arrived from Arabia and regions of East Africa, areas controlled by Phoenician trade routes. Archaeologist Israel Finkelstein explains that the gold from Ophir was so valuable that it was used only in royal works. Its purity surpassed that of ordinary gold, and it reflected light exceptionally well, making it perfect for illuminating the temple's interior spaces. This gold had been amassed over years by King David. Solomon did not start from scratch. He inherited tons of gold ready for the temple, in addition to international tributes and contributions. Working on it was no easy task. It required a precise combination of skill, patience, and refined technique. Ancient metallurgy specialist Oded Borowski describes the process in great detail. Pure gold ingots were heated until red hot to soften them. They were then placed on large stone anvils. Dozens of artisans repeatedly hammered the metal with bronze hammers. Blow after blow, the gold expanded, became thinner, and transformed into a flexible sheet just a few millimeters thick. These sheets were so thin they could be folded and shaped like an animal's hide. But each panel had to be perfect. The artisans cut the sheets, carefully shaped them, and placed them one on top of the other, fitting them to the walls like golden scales. A single panel could take weeks to complete. The process was slow, meticulous, and exhausting. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of sheets were needed to completely cover the temple. It wasn't just manual labor, it was an act of worship. But the gold wasn't applied directly to stone. First, the interior walls were lined with Lebanese cedar wood. This wood acted as a perfect base for adhering the gold leaf. A special layer of acacia resin mixed with aromatic oils and a highly adhesive organic glue was applied to the cedar. This mixture acted as a natural glue to fix the gold. Oded Borowski states that this technique resembles the Egyptian methods used to decorate sarcophagi and royal thrones, but in the temple it was applied on a monumental scale that no structure in ancient Egypt ever matched. Each sheet had to be perfectly smooth. The artisans polished any imperfections with smooth stones brought from the Jordan Valley. The final result was an interior that looked like solid gold. How much gold was needed to achieve such splendor? Modern calculations, based on chronicles and the studies of archaeologist Amihai Mazar, indicate that between 3 and 5 tons of pure gold were needed just to cover the main building. If we add up the giant cherubim, the candelabras, the tables, the moldings, the utensils, the doors, and the altar of incense, the total easily exceeds 20 tons. This figure makes Solomon's temple one of the most expensive buildings ever constructed in the entire history of the ancient world. But gold was not just about wealth. For the rabbis, gold was about theology. For Maimonides, gold represents divine purity. That which is eternal does not rust. For Rashi, gold allows the light of God to be reflected without blemish. For Ibn Ezra, the gold of the temple was a shadow of the heavenly light. In the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant rested, gold covered every inch. There, everything gleamed. Each hammered sheet was a spiritual declaration. The God who would dwell in that place is worthy of the most precious thing that exists. The temple was adorned with gold because the glory of the eternal God deserved to be surrounded by the purest, most valuable, and most resplendent things the ancient world could offer. Fifth, the colossal bronze of the temple, art, technology, and glory. If gold filled the interior of the temple with light, colossal bronze was the material that made the exterior a majestic work of art. The bronze of Solomon's temple was not merely a functional metal. It was the visible manifestation of the power, judgment, and authority of the God of Israel. And its creation was a technical feat that only the most advanced artisans of the ancient world could accomplish. The Bible mentions that Solomon sent for Hiram Abi, a master craftsman from Tyre, full of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge in all kinds of bronze work. This man is described by historians as one of the most brilliant metallurgists of his generation. His task was no small feat. He had to create gigantic, symmetrical, and perfectly cast pieces, some of which surpassed anything that had been made before in Israel. The most impressive piece was the Bronze Sea, a gigantic fountain used for the purification of priests. Its size astonishes even modern experts. It measured almost 5 meters in diameter and had a capacity of over 40,000 liters of water. Archaeologist Oded Borowski, an expert in ancient metallurgy, states that melting a vessel of this size was nearly impossible without advanced technology. It required Archaeologist Oded Borowski, an expert in ancient metallurgy, states that melting a vessel of this size was nearly impossible without advanced technology. It required the Bronze Sea rested on 12 metal oxen, 3 facing north, 3 south, 3 east, and 3 west. These figures were not decorative. They symbolized the strength of the kingdom and divine stability upholding the purification of the people. Along the length of the temple were placed movable bases and columns decorated with figures of oxen, lions, palm trees, and cherubim. These pieces were so detailed that archaeologists consider them a masterpiece of Phoenician art, renowned for their precision and beauty. Professor Amihai Mazar comments that the temple bases show a level of fine casting comparable to the royal art of Tyre and Sidon, where metallurgy was an ancestral tradition. These bases had assembled wheels and reinforced supports. It was cast bronze, carved with special tools, and carefully polished to form smooth, ornamental surfaces. At the entrance to the temple stood 2 colossal bronze columns called Jachin and Boaz. Each one was more than 8 meters high, with a diameter so large that 2 men could not easily walk around it. They were hollow columns, cast in vertical molds, and then covered with ornamental capitals that imitated pomegranate leaves. Rabbi Rashi teaches that these pillars symbolized two prophetic promises. Yakin, he will establish. Boaz, in him is strength. They were literally visual declarations erected at the entrance of the temple, reminding everyone that all firmness and authority come from the God of Israel. Archaeologists believe that Solomon established an entire industrial complex solely for the temple's casting. It was likely located in the Jordan Valley, where there was ample space and an abundance of clay for molds. Archaeologist Gershon Edelstein states that double-chambered furnaces were used, one to generate constant heat and another to melt large quantities of bronze. The process was meticulous and almost artistic. First, copper and tin were mixed in exact proportions, a formula that artisans had perfected over generations. Next, the solid metal was placed at the top of the furnace, while the lower furnace generated intense heat capable of liquefying the entire mixture. Once molten, the metal flowed down specially designed channels to guide it without loss or impurities. Below, the mold awaited, reinforced with layers of hardened clay to withstand the extreme temperature. After cooling, the piece was carefully removed and polished with abrasive stones until it achieved a perfect shine. It was a lengthy process, but the result was worthy of the temple, durable, beautiful, and ready for the service of God. This method requires mathematics, precision, and a deep understanding of the metal's behavior. According to experts, the smelting of the sea of bronze may have required between 20 and 30 simultaneous furnaces, coordinated at precisely the same time. It was the largest documented bronze foundry of the 10th century BC. For the Jewish sages, bronze spoke of divine justice. It was the metal of sacrifice, the metal of the altar, the metal of judgment. The Talmud teaches that where bronze appears in the temple, so too does the power of God that purifies and corrects. That is why the main altar was made of bronze. That is why the sea of purification was made of bronze. That is why the entrance to the temple was framed in bronze. It was a visual message. God's holiness demands purification and reverence. Hiram Abiff and his team created the largest bronze production known in the biblical world. No Mesopotamian, Canaanite, or Egyptian temple possessed pieces of this magnitude. Historian John Bright concludes, "The metallurgy of Solomon's temple was an industrial undertaking on a national scale. It required resources, knowledge, artistry, and an organization that only a strong kingdom could provide." However, Solomon's temple was not just gold, cedar, and bronze. It wasn't just splendor, it was an engineering masterpiece, a sacred structure that combined architecture, acoustics, ventilation, stability, and interior distribution in such an advanced way that even today experts are surprised when they study it. Behind every wall, behind every measurement, and behind every chamber, there was a design that seems to surpass the possibilities of the 10th century before Christ. The temple's layout began with what everyone knew from the outside: the courtyard, the holy place, and the most holy place. But what many don't realize is that the temple wasn't an empty building like a large open hall. Quite the opposite. The main sanctuary was surrounded by a series of internal chambers and rooms that formed a kind of ring around the building. Archaeologist Lean Rittmeyer, one of the leading experts on temple architecture, describes this structure as the finest example of stepped design in the ancient world. These chambers not only served to store priestly vestments, sacred utensils, and treasures, but also functioned as a structural system that reinforced the weight of the entire building without the need for internal columns. This means something surprising. The temple was a 3-story building, connected by narrow staircases and hidden passageways. It was a living sanctuary, with movement, circulation, and logistics. It wasn't a primitive structure. It was an intelligently planned architectural work. But the temple's engineering wasn't just visible in its walls. It could also be heard. In the holy place, the acoustics were so perfect that the priests' voices seemed to float without unwanted echoes. Professor Gershon Bar Kochva points out that the Cedar of Lebanon, used to clad the walls, acted as a natural resonator, while the gold sheets amplified mid-range frequencies. This made the Levitical chants sound exceptionally clear, as if the temple had been designed so that worship would resonate cleanly and envelopingly. It is an impressive detail when we consider that this occurred many years before Christ. long before the great European cathedrals famous for their sacred acoustics existed. Another challenge was ventilation. A building completely covered in gold would have to be stifling, especially in a hot climate like Jerusalem's. However, the temple didn't suffer from this problem. How did they solve it? Archaeologist Yigal Shiloh explains that tall windows known as clerestory windows were opened in the upper walls. From the outside, they appeared narrow and small, almost insignificant. But inside, they were larger and better able to capture rising air currents. This allowed hot air to escape constantly, while light entered without compromising the sanctuary's privacy. It was a passive ventilation system ahead of its time, comparable to modern techniques in green building. Inside the temple, the giant doors were also remarkable. Solid wood doors covered in gold, carved with cherubs and palm trees. Doors so large they seemed impossible to move. However, experts believe that Phoenician artisans designed a system of bronze hinges mounted on reinforced wooden studs that allowed them to open and close smoothly. They were heavy doors, but not cumbersome. They were functional and precise. But without a doubt, the most impressive feature of the temple was the Holy of Holies, a perfect cube 20 cubits wide, 20 cubits long, and 20 cubits high, roughly equivalent to 10 meters on each side. There were no windows, no natural light, no instruments, only the Ark of the Covenant and two giant cherubim, also covered in gold. For the rabbis, the cubic shape symbolized divine perfection. For modern engineers, it is astonishing that a room without openings, without columns, and covered in gold could remain structurally stable. Archaeologist Benjamin Mazar points out that Mount Moriah, being a rocky and firm mountain, allowed for the construction of a perfectly balanced sanctuary. The Holy of Holies was not just architecture, it was mystery. It was the point where, according to the faith of Israel, heaven touched earth. Rabbi Nachmanides writes that the Holy of Holies was not a room, it was a throne. Every Hebrew understood that the Shekinah, the visible presence of God, would descend there. Solomon's temple was completed after 7 years of continuous work, exactly as the scripture states. Let's read the first book of Kings, chapter 6, verse 38. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its rooms and in all its fittings. He built it in 7 years. This verse sealed the culmination of the most magnificent sacred work of ancient Israel. 7 years of engineering, artistry, international logistics, and thousands of dedicated workers finally left before the eyes of the world a building beyond compare. If someone approached from afar, the first thing they saw was the brightness. The white limestone rocks reflected the sunlight as if the mountain itself had been set on fire. The pillars Jachin and Boaz stood in colossal bronze, and the enormous bronze sea rested on 12 metal oxen, proclaiming the strength and purity of the God of Israel. But the real wonder began upon entering. Inside, the beauty was indescribable. The cedar-clad walls perfumed the air. On that cedar, thousands of hammered sheets of pure gold covered every surface. There was no bare corner. The interior shone like a chamber of living light. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus said that the brightness was so intense that the visitor had to look away because of the magnitude of the glow. Modern architects try to imagine the cost of such a building. Archaeologist Kenneth Kitchen, a specialist in Near Eastern economics, calculated that the gold amassed by David alone would be worth more than $7 billion today. Archaeologist Amihai Mazar estimates that between gold, silver, bronze, precious stones, real woods, international labor, and logistics, the total cost of the temple could exceed $20 billion in current values. Researcher Gershon Galil concludes that no building in the ancient world received such an investment for a single sanctuary. This calculation is not surprising when we look inside. Gold covered everything. The walls, the moldings, the doors, the giant 5-meter-tall cherubim, the altar of incense, the utensils, and the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant rested. The Cedar of Lebanon, felled by Phoenician masters and transported by sea on rafts, filled the air with a noble aroma. The colossal bronze, crafted by Hiram Abiff, surrounded the atrium with artistry and power. Nothing was left to chance. Every material had been selected to honor the glory of the eternal God. Archaeologist Lean Rittmeyer points out that the interior of the temple was not just beautiful, It was theology in the form of architecture. The perfect proportions, the gold reflecting light, the incorruptible cedar, and the bronze of judgment all composed a message. The God who dwells in the midst of Israel is holy, eternal, and worthy of all excellence. When Israel saw the finished work, the people understood that they were standing before something no other nation possessed. The elders wept with emotion. The priests knew they were about to serve in the holiest place the earth could offer. The foreigners recognized that it had no human explanation. The temple was not a monument of man. It was the visible testimony that God had chosen to dwell among the children of Israel. This is how the temple turned out. Beautiful on the outside with its splendor, its strength, and its grandeur. Beautiful on the inside with its gold, its cedar, and its holy aroma. A work built in 7 years, valued by experts at billions of dollars in today's dollars, but whose spiritual value cannot be measured. It was the heart of Israel and the earthly throne of the God of heaven. The day appointed for the inauguration of Solomon's temple dawned like no other in the history of Israel. From the early hours of the morning, Jerusalem was filled with pilgrims climbing its cobbled streets towards Mount Moriah. That day coincided with the Feast of Tabernacles, a celebration of joy and gratitude, but this time it would have an eternal meaning. The newly completed temple shone in the sunlight as if covered in motionless fire, reflecting gold, cedar, and bronze in every corner. The priests wore pure linen. The Levites tuned cymbals, psalteries, and harps. The whole atmosphere exuded reverence. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus describes that the city seemed like a river of light, and the temple a mountain of gold. Then the giant doors of the temple opened for the first time. The people held their breath. The elders of Israel took their positions, and the priests took the Ark of the Covenant, the one that had guided Israel from the desert, and began to carry it into the sanctuary. As they advanced, the Levites chanted sacred songs. The sound of 100 trumpets filled the air. And when the priests placed the ark under the wings of the 2 giant cherubim in the most holy place, something happened that would change the spiritual history of the nation. Let us read the second book of Chronicles, chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. Then the house of the Lord, was filled with a cloud. And the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. The cloud was not natural smoke. It was the visible manifestation of the glory of the eternal God. The priests fell to the ground. The crowd began to weep. The atmosphere became so heavy with holiness that no one could stand. Flavius Josephus says that a reverent, thick, and living light filled the sanctuary, as if heaven itself had descended to earth. Then King Solomon ascended the bronze platform built for the ceremony. He stretched out his hands toward heaven and uttered a prayer so profound that it still moves every reader of Scripture today. In the midst of his prayer, he asked for something that reveals his pastoral heart toward the nation. Let us read in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 6, verses 18 and 19. But will God indeed dwell with man on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? But you will regard the prayer of your servant and his supplication, O Lord my God, to hear the cry and the prayer with which your servant prays before you. When Solomon finished praying, heaven responded immediately and supernaturally. Note what it says in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. God himself kindled the sacrifice. God approved the work. God took his throne in that sanctuary. It was divine confirmation that the temple would be the spiritual center of Israel and the point where heaven and earth would meet. Then the people fell prostrate with their faces to the ground and worshipped deeply, saying, "For he is good, and his mercy endures forever." Beloved brothers and sisters, that day marked a turning point in the history of Israel. Not only was a building inaugurated, but an era was inaugurated. The glory of God had descended to dwell in the house that Solomon built with excellence, obedience, and splendor. Thus concluded the inauguration of Solomon's temple, beautiful on the outside with its monumental architecture, glorious on the inside with its gold, cedar, and cherubim, but even more glorious because the presence of the eternal God filled that place, overflowing with light, fire, and glory. And so we come to the end of this video. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us until the end. I invite you to share this teaching so that more people may be edified and reflect on the Word of God. See you in the next video, and may the peace of the Lord be with you and your family today and always. May God bless you abundantly.